our size. Oh, okay. If you look at a current beaver compared to the historic beaver, the giant beaver, this would be the size difference. They'd be monsters. But there were earlier beavers too that vanished from the scene. And one of these was the beaver that made this incredible structure. Have you ever heard of the Devil's Corkscrew or Demonolix? These were tunnels found, I think it was Nebraska. And look at this. This is what they found these in sandstone, these fossil spiral things with, at the end, there were these canals going up. And they had no idea what they were. And there was great debates, by the way, in the late 1800s, whether they were caused by plants or by animals. Very nasty debates. And it wasn't until, oh gosh, 100 years later almost, that they discovered that the maker of this was a beaver, a burrowing beaver that uses teeth to cut out these spiral tunnels down to where the chambers were down below, which were angled upwards to avoid being flooded. And they're huge. So we have a current beaver greatly different than the historic beavers that some didn't make it, but one lineage carried on, and here we have our beavers. But there are two species in the world. We have the North American beaver, Castor canadensis, and we have the Eurasian beaver, Castor fiber. When I was doing the beaver book, I actually went to Norway to photograph this species right here. The publisher told me if I included this beaver in the book, there'd be a European co-publisher. Well, that wasn't true. It didn't pan out. And I spent an awful lot of money going to Norway to get a few photographs, but it was worth it to see the beaver in this natural habitat over there. So we have the range then in the world of these two different beavers. And move this over here a little bit. There, yeah, there. And you can see there's also a red area. Well, that is where there's actually, I believe it's down here in the bottom. I can't see because of this thing down here. So I'll try to move. Yeah, where both species can be found, because our beavers were introduced to some of the areas over here, primarily in the 50s up to the 70s, because they thought they were one species. And the Eurasian beaver was wiped out nearly to extinction like ours was, first by trappers, and then North American beavers next. And so they thought same species, let's bring them over to Finland and so on, let them go. Well, now our beavers are classified in Finland as an invasive species. And they are quite similar. They're hard to tell apart. There's the Eurasian above and there's ours below. They look pretty similar. The color can vary, so the color is similar. The tails are a bit different. Many of the Eurasian beavers, in my understanding, live in faster flowing water, and they do have narrower tails. Ours, as they get older, have much wider paddles on the back end. There's differences too in chromosomes and so on in skull structure, but on the outset, they're pretty hard to tell apart, and they both eat plants, and they both love eating in the water. They both cut down trees, so a lot of similarities in their life histories. So back to the title, World's Most Powerful Animals. Well, if I polled people and asked them what they might offer, they could say the moose, the bear, the wolf, and certainly maybe the elephant. But in my opinion, these pale in comparison to the power of the beaver, whether it's Eurasian or North American. And the reason is this, is that beavers not only have their own survival mechanisms and so on, but they also create habitat. And that habitat supports a wide diversity of animals. And how do they do that? Well, they cut down trees with their teeth, which very few animals can do. They build structures, especially the dam seen here in the foreground. And that dam creates a flooded land, creates a pond, and that pond supports a great diversity of plants and animals. There's some wood ducks here and a green heron. And mammals like river otters. And even animals that aren't really pond associated will come to the pond to get food. So this mallard was nesting by the pond's edge, and this red fox caught it as food. I hear a little bit of talking in the background. But anyway, so that's our beaver. And our beaver is a fascinating animal because it spends part of his life out of the water. So it's got.
I'm just going to ask people to mute, please.
Yeah,
You're coming
that'd be
through.
great. Thank you. Okay. All right. So beavers spend part of their life outside of the water. So you have adaptations. Is somebody trying to
Sheila,
read?
you're not on mute. Sheila?
Okay, I'll try it again. Sorry. So beaver spends part of their life on land, but of course, much of their life spent in the water. So you have a lot of adaptations for the water. They are a semi-aquatic mammal.
And Marie, I'll be at the other end of the table at about 1:30. I'm going to the luncheon, so
This
I'll
is
come
really
after that.
difficult. Sorry.
Sorry, I'm gonna miss it.
Excuse
This
me.
is Don here, and I'm going to interrupt and just say,
Thanks,
ask
Don.
everybody to mute their microphone. Sheila, you are, you're.
Sheila Clark needs to mute her mic.
Oh.
Marie Phil Antonio needs to mute their mic.
Me? So I'm going to ask everybody to mute.
Oops, I'm getting away. Okay. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay. All right. So adaptations for the water include huge hind feet that are webbed for swimming. An odd placement of all their sensory organs, the ears, the eyes, and the nose are in a straight line on top of the head. Very few animals have this. Hippopotami do, and crocodiles do. And our beaver has that same thing. They can float to the surface with just the upper part of their head visible, and they can hear, see, and smell at the same time. The eye has a clear membrane over it, like underwater goggles. And their hair is so dense it repels water. They have about 20,000 square hairs per square centimeter on their bodies. And that keeps out the water. Now, there was a belief that they added oil from an oil gland to waterproof their fur. That's proven to be false largely. They have glands all over their body, and as they rub the hair, they do get some waterproofing ability. But the hair, the denseness of the hair, the density of the hair is the primary reason they keep water off their bodies. They spend a lot of time grooming, though. This is where it's believed that they picked up the oil from, but it's not. The oil glands are actually used for marking territories in part, and also communication, giving individual scents to beavers. But as they groom and keep their hair tidy and keep out ectoparasites, they've got an incredible tool on their hind feet. And that is a couple of split toenails that look like this. No one knows how they're used, but they rub them through their fur, and very likely like a comb, taking out tangles, maybe squeezing out water perhaps, and maybe removing things like ticks or mites from the body. The tail is highly modified. This, to me, the Swiss Army knife of tails of all animals in the world. It's multifunctional. The tail is covered in scales, first of all. At least 2/3 is. The bottom third, the basal third, is all muscle and fully haired, but the outer 2/3 is full of scales. And that allowed the French, by the way, in the 1750s to declare the beaver to be a fish, so people could eat it on Fridays. Here's a tail. It can be used as a rudder when swimming, a counterbalance when floating at the water's surface. It can be used for thermoregulation. The beavers in the winter cut down blood supply to the tail. In the base of the tail is a counter current heat exchanger, which allows the blood coming down here to be cold, about 1 to 3 degrees above freezing, which conserves heat loss. And the blood going back to the heart is warmed by this counter current heat exchanger. In summer, they turn off that system, pump more blood to the tail to lose heat to the water around them. They don't use the tail for building. That's a fallacy. But they use it as a prop on land. And they can put the tail behind their body when they're cutting down trees or cutting or chewing through wood, or in front of their body when they're doing grooming to expose the bottom side of their belly for further grooming. And importantly, they can use that tail for communication. And beaver tail slaps are famous, of course. And there you can see the muscle, by the way, the bottom third of the tail that powers it. The tail comes up, the tail goes down, and a resounding slap occurs that displaces a lot of water. This loud slapping sound can startle a predator or also warn other beavers in the colony, because beavers do live in colonies, of impending danger. By the way, tail slaps to me are beaver art, and just love trying to photograph different configurations of tail slaps. In my beaver book, The Dam Builders, I speculate that they have two types of tail slaps for different dives. And I photographed beavers doing deep dives. You know, sometimes a beaver will slap its tail, come back up, slap again, and slap again. That's the shallow dive. They have a deep dive, though, where they're very alarmed and they're not seen again because they can stay underwater for 15 minutes. In the deep dive, the tail behaves like this. It takes water in first very quickly. Here's the head going down. The tail comes up and throws a lot of water as it comes up. So, and then the tail goes down to correct the beaver's motion underwater. And you see two water events, one from the tail thrusting up and one from the tail hitting the water. So it looks like this. And that's only visible under high-speed photography. But I've noticed that this happens during those deep dives. And I speculate that maybe it's, you know, that's the way they use the tail for leverage before they begin the deep dive down. Beavers build ponds because they eat in the water safety. They bring food down and a whole variety of soft herbaceous foods. In summer, they bring down things like virgin's bower here and raspberry and things like that. They of course eat a lot of bark and twigs. And another thing about beavers, they'll be eating away and they'll stop and they'll smell their food. They have an incredible discriminating power of smell, and they can smell the food, see if it's edible or not, and also is it the right type of food. By the way, it's known that beavers in Alaska, given 7 types of willows, one of their favorites, will select only 3 species, and they can tell those species by the smell of the bark. Something we have trouble with just with microscopes looking at leaf characters and so on. They eat a lot of water plants. They eat water lilies like the yellow pond lily or white water lily. And with these aquatic plants, they devour the flowers, the stems, the underwater rhizomes, and they love the leaves. Adult beavers just shove them into their mouth like a cob of corn and chomp, 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 chomp. Young beavers tend to roll the leaf into a wrap-like shape to get it inside their mouth. And were you aware that beavers flossed after meals? Well, no, it's not flossing, eating more of the underwater rhizomes there. And this one's not doing drugs, it's eating bark. Beavers have favorite feeding platforms, and the plants are all flattened down, and you find debris on top from previously enjoyed meals. So these are all signs of beavers eating on their favorite platforms. Sometimes the meals can be large. And by the way, I mentioned selection. Beavers love poplars, and they will go, and I watch this beaver not only smell the tree trunks to ascertain there was the right type of tree, they smelled a bunch of poplars till it smelled a bunch of poplars until it cut one down, clearly selecting not only the species of tree, but the quality of the tree as well. Poplar and the bark of other trees like willow and so on is primarily a winter food, although they will, if available, eat the bark in summer as well. And they can chew through the wood in seconds. It's amazing how fast they can cut through it. And that's because their teeth are really sharp. They self-sharpen, by the way, and never stop growing. Those incisors have a lot of iron in the enamel that strengthens the teeth, hence the orange coloration. The back part is softer dentine, so it wears faster, keeping these teeth really quite sharp, like a chisel at the front. When they chew through wood, they anchor their top teeth on the wood and use the bottom incisors to slice through, or sorry, they anchor their bottom teeth and use their top teeth to slice through it. And when they go on land to cut down trees, it's often for building supplies, which they drag across the water surface, holding the item in their teeth. And then they build their structures. And of course, the dam is the primary structure that creates the habitat they live in. And they bring up mud and other material in their front paws and add sticks, which they carry in their mouth. Eventually, when the dam is finished, it can hold back a huge amount of water, and often a small lake is actually a beaver pond. Of course, in the pond, they build their house, the lodge, and the lodge is a really interesting structure where it is hollowed out from inside, and they have 2 levels, one for sleeping and one lower one for eating. They constantly maintain it by bringing up sticks and mud. And here is the famous double carry, as I call it: stick in the mouth, mud held against the chest. And what amazes me is these guys can waddle up their lodge full of trip hazards and not trip. I trip on power cords for computers, and they can do this and add the material without falling down. It's pretty remarkable. At the end, what a castle they've created. You know, a beautiful, safe structure with a moat all around in many cases. Older beaver lodges are easily told from current ones because plants grow on top and soon obscure them. Also, with active lodges, you'll see trails where the beavers have chewed their way through the vegetation or dragged branches through the vegetation, keeping open trails all the way to the lodge and around it. Of course, they live in that lodge year round. Usually there's 3 generations of beavers in a lodge, the pair that started the colony, and beavers that are a year old, and then the new ones from the previous, the most recent spring. And that lodge keeps them fairly warm during the winter. But they don't put much mud on top of the lodge. They need ventilation. And so they allow air to escape up here, which creates lovely hoarfrost patterns on top of the lodge, which gives you an indication that beavers are inside it still. If you see a lodge totally covered in snow, no hoarfrost crystals, then you haven't found an active beaver lodge. Have you ever wondered, where do beavers sleep before they have a lodge? Well, I've always wondered that, and I found them in a few situations. This is at the edge of a pond on a lovely mossy covered ledge. Or if it's a pond being reclaimed again, often in older lodges, they'll sleep like this, or even on the current lodge being built. This one was doing that. And not only was this beaver, visible on top of the lodge, it also allowed me to photograph a really unusual color form, the blonde form of beavers. Isn't seen that often. And not only is it an uncommon color form, apparently this kind of beaver has a lot more fun than the other ones do that are more darkly colored. By the way, one day I came back to this lodge and I thought the beaver was dead. It was lying like this, no sign of life. I thought, what killed it? But then I realized it was sleeping. I watched the chest slowly rise and fall. And at one point, it had a bad dream. He started to shuffle and put his head up and snort, then went back to sleep again. Eventually, the lodge is fully finished, and they carve out from underwater 2 ways of getting in, and then of course, the little platforms inside where they sleep or when they eat. I mentioned there's often 3 generations of beavers in a colony. You have the adults and you have beavers that are almost 2 years old as you approach the spring. This is an adult beaver with a newly born young. The young ones stay close to the adults through their first year especially. But when they approach their 2nd birthday, they get evicted from the pond by the adults, often the male. And they do it physically. I've seen this strange thing I call the beaver dance, where they seem to lock teeth and they actually start to spin around on top of the water. It's unbelievable. And there's shows of strength as well, where the adult will push the 2-year-old and sometimes even bite its tail. But the young ones stay with the parents for 2 years almost. And right through the winter as well, of course. Fall is a very busy time in the beaver world. They add a lot of new material to the lodges to get ready for winter. And there's that famous double carry I mentioned, with a stick in the mouth and the mud against the chest. They get really dirty during this time of year. But of course they wash, they groom themselves regularly and keep it clean. And they do a lot of foraging on land, even when the snow starts falling. They go up and they start bringing down material to add to their food pile, which is a big pile of branches near their lodge. On top, they often add speckled alder to hold down the good stuff beneath. And they do so by creating these drag trails from the lodge, from the pond up into the forest. And they're called drag trails, not because the beavers change their appearance on them, it's because they drag down branches down to the water safety. Then they haul the branches across the water over to the food pile, which is always near the lodge. And they swim under the ice then to get the food in winter. And there's some more material added on top of the food pile. And these swell and swell and swell. And beavers get more day active as you get through late fall before freeze up, even in daytime. And here you can see they've added cedar on top, not to eat, but to hold the good stuff down. It's just ballast. The good stuff they bring back and they dive with it below the food pile, added to the bottom. And especially poplars. Now this big beaver here dragged a huge branch down to the water. It was so big when it got to the food pile, it couldn't drag it under the water. It tried for several minutes to pull it under, but it was too buoyant. So what did that beaver do? It chewed through it and took each half down then, showing how important that poplar is as winter food. So the food pile is built up and built up. Here's hoarfrost on it. And beavers will continue to drag down material until ice forms on the water. And even beyond that, beavers create channels open through the ice from the lodge to the shore and around the food pile until the ice gets too thick to break. So beavers do break this ice in the early morning when the ice is thin, and especially in November. How do beavers break the ice, do you wonder? Is it with sandwiches and nice little drinks? They break the ice that way? No, they break the ice with the back of their heads. And they come up to the thin ice early in the morning and smash through repeatedly to create the open area. Bubbles help weaken the ice. And those are bubbles in black ice. And I always wondered, how do the bubbles get there? Well, not because beavers do this, but because their hair traps air inside the lodge. And when they swim under the ice, the bubbles come up and it's stuck in the ice. And by the way, were you aware that beavers wore masks during COVID? How about that? Really good Canadians, aren't they? Anyway, they keep these areas open, and we see them on top of the ice until the ice gets too thick to break through. Now, beavers, when they are active, always stop and smell the air. Their power of smell is their main means of sensing danger. When they're on land cutting through logs and trees, they stop and stand up and smell regularly. And signs like this tell us that beavers have been active even after the snow fell. Now, being on top of the snow can have its disadvantages. Beavers are very slow. In Algonquin Park, wolves catch beavers regularly. And in this case, I just missed seeing wolves and a beaver. I was seeing the previous evening at dusk. I went there before daybreak the following day, and all I found was this. And sadly, it was late February, but it was one of those warm days where it rained heavily before I got there, and all the tracks were washed away. So I went over to the site and found a bit of fur like this and part of the digestive tract. Beavers have extensions on the intestines called cecum, or cecum singular, ceca is plural. and they're full of bacteria that break down the cellulose of the plants they eat. And so here we had probably the cecum, and they had bits of fur. So it was a case of hide and cecum. And I wondered where the carcass went, because there's no carcass. So I looked around, and I saw that most of the lake edge was a bit of a cliff, but the back end was sort of a ramp of talus slope. So I snowshoed up there, and what did I hear? Screams of ravens, which led me to the beaver carcass stashed under a log. The wolves didn't do this, but I soon found out by hiding and waiting about an hour and a half what did, and it was a red fox. And it dragged out the carcass to enjoy the few scraps left by those wolves. By the way, beavers are highly territorial, and they mark their territory with scent mounds. In Canada, they push them up and fresh mud all the time, and then they deposit scents on top. One scent is deposited with the urine that comes from the castor sac, the famous castor sacs used in the perfume industry. And the other, some anal glands, anal glands, and they have to rub to stimulate those glands to add the material. So they had two chemical bases to the scent mounds, and these tell their beavers who is there and to stay away if you're a strange beaver. And beavers do fight if a territory boundary is crossed. Here's two huge beavers that were going at it. They wrestled like wrestlers would do, but also tried to bite each other. And there was a very serious injury incurred here. And finally, after about 15 minutes, the victor went to shore, but his muscle was severed on this arm, and he couldn't use that forearm anymore. Even though he won and he shivered and he whined for about 20 minutes. So anyways, beavers have a pretty fascinating life history. And of course, they build the dam to create the pond that will not freeze to the bottom in winter. And the bigger the pond becomes, the more area of safety they can forage near the water's edge. Dams play important roles in nutrient recycling. In the pond itself, nutrients build up like phosphorus and so on. And in springtime and a fall with heavy rains, there's a mixture of oxygen in the water, and it gets transfixed into or transformed into a form plants can use and washed out of the pond. And so phosphorus and nitrogen are important nutrients that plants use, and beaver ponds can supply those to the plants that live downstream from the dam. So they built the dam pond for their own benefit, of course, but that supports a huge diversity of life. That's a beaver dam with mallards on it and a moose behind. It's a great area for wildflowers, things like white water lilies and bullhead lily, as I mentioned. The leaves are food for insects. Here's a water lily leaf beetle chewing its way through, creating spectacular patterns that reminds me in this case of what's her name? The one that went to the ball at midnight and became a pumpkin. What's her name? Oh, geez. You know who I mean. Anyways, she was waiting for a prince to come and put her slipper on her foot. I forget her
Cinderella.
name.
Cinderella.
Cinderella. That's the one, right? Of course. Muskrats often inhabit beaver ponds, eating the plants by the edge. And the water shields that grow there, tiny little plants with interesting leaves, they are really important food for a moose because they contain about 400 times more sodium than plants on shore do. Moose in Algonquin Park in the northern areas get most of the sodium supply from aquatic plants, especially those found in beaver ponds. Of course, there's a huge diversity of insects on the water surface, like water striders, whirligig beetles, midges that swarm above the water, that live their larval stage in the mud down below. Lots of insects arise, and predatory insects feed on the midges, as do damselflies and dragonflies. Great diversity, including things like white-faced meadowhawks and things like common whitetails, 12-spotted skimmers, 4-spotted skimmers. even ones that bear the name of the habitat, beaver pond basket tail and beaver pond clubtail. So lots of dragonflies spend their life in the water for a year as a nymph, then emerge as flying dragonflies. Of course, there's predatory amphibians. Here's a mink frog, bullfrog, and there's other frogs too. Things like American toads don't live in the pond, but come down to lay their eggs in early spring. And here's a pair of mating toads, female much larger, looking a little bit unhappy, and one guy below looking pretty excited. Gray tree frogs live in the forest, but come to beaver ponds to lay their eggs. Here's a tadpole of a gray tree frog. Its tail matching the pattern on the leaves on the bottom beautifully. There are predatory snakes that come to the edge, northern water snakes, or in this case, a ribbon snake, found in more southern beaver ponds. And of course, there's reptiles like snapping turtles, painted turtles, mammals like mink come to hunt. Otters are commonly found in beaver ponds, devouring fish like bullheads, or in this case, even little painted turtles that were dormant on the bottom. I put a 5-cent piece here with the beaver for scale. Great blue herons come to feed, as do black-crowned night herons, green herons, belted kingfishers. Beaver ponds are nurseries for geese and ducks, Canada geese, wood ducks, hooded mergansers. Lots of aquatic life in those ponds. But there's one aspect of beaver ponds that people don't like, and that is, as the pond develops, it drowns trees, and people see dead trees quite often as a negative thing. Well, as the trees begin to die, defenses wane, different fungi will grow on them to digest the wood. The weakening trees attract beetles like longhorn beetles that lay their eggs under the bark, and the larvae eat the wood. There are things like flat-headed borers, young jewel beetles that chew their patterns under the bark, as do bark beetles, even smaller beetles. The eggs are laid in a huge string, and as they hatch, the larvae chew their way out without crossing each other's paths. They can sense the vibrations of their siblings and create these beautiful patterns as they grow larger and larger until they finally pupate. Of course, these insects are food for woodpeckers, and in Algonquin Park, especially blackback woodpeckers thrive around beaver ponds and even nest in trees at the edge, as do northern flickers. And once those holes are vacant the following year, these are homes for tree swallows, gray-crested flycatchers, even northern saw-whet owls. The dead branches are purchased for olive-sided flycatchers. And larger birds, like this is a young broad-winged hawk coming to hunt for frogs and snakes. And in winter, great gray owls use these for purchase too. Of course, the dead branches are used by things like osprey for building nests and great blue herons. And herons often nest in the dead trees in beaver ponds, but perfect spots because they're safe from predators. And when those nests aren't used, they can be usurped by great horned owls. So lots of animals benefit from those dead trees, including spiders. And you never realize how many spiders there are till you see dew in late summer on the grasses or up in the dead trees. And the orb weavers create the most spectacular of these webs, in my opinion. But these trees don't last forever. After a number of years being drowned, they will fall down. Then they become roost sites for things like American black ducks, painted turtles for basking in the sun. Here's a hooded merganser behind them. And nurse logs for plants like roundleaf sundew and various sedges. And leatherleaf growing here as well. And to me, the dead trees are an important part of beaver ponds because they add this element of beauty. And I just love looking at dead trees early in the morning or in the evening. They create a really intriguing aspect of beauty that's not there otherwise. But ponds don't last forever. On the average, about 10 years, Beavers may vacate because of lack of food, or maybe they're killed by predators, or whatever reason they're gone. When they're gone, the dams aren't maintained. The dams will break with high water levels. And the bottom of that pond is full of nutrients, really rich organic material. And very soon after a pond drains, plants start growing, sedges and grasses, but primarily sedges, and forming a very lush meadow like this. And these are called beaver meadows. The old beaver lodge is present right back over here in the corner. You can see it here. And sedges are really common in these spots. This is the hop sedge. This is the bristly sedge, I think, Carex camosa. And of course, think of sedge, you think of Bill Crins, who's one of the world's expert on sedges. Anyway, sedges are food for small butterflies like skippers, long dash, hobobonk, and pecks. There's lots of skippers found in these habitats. There are caterpillars like smartweed caterpillars found there as well. Various types of grasshoppers, orthopterans are found there, including the coneheads. And these can be captured by larger insects. This is a great golden digger wasp at the edge of a beaver pond I found last year, and it paralyzed the conehead. It dragged it down to the ground to a pre-existing burrow, stuck it down there, laid the eggs on it, and covered up the burrow again, leaving the eggs to hatch and the young larvae to devour their paralyzed but still alive huge meal. Bears come down and they love grazing sedges and grasses in early spring. These meadows become incredible wildflower gardens. Steeplebush here, grassleaf goldenrod here, all sorts of different asters and things like monkey flower and so on. Just it's incredible diversity. Bottle gentian here, and swamp milkweed with dun skippers on it. This is boneset with Atlantis fritillary nectaring. So great gardens of wildflowers full of butterflies. And of course, where there's insects flying, there are spiders like more of the orb weavers, and crab spiders like the goldenrod crab spider here on top of the flowers. Jumping spiders too. So a whole variety of animals, many small ones especially, are found in beaver meadows once the pond has gone, including spread wings here. These meadows are ideal habitat for meadow voles, one of the most important small mammals in the world. They fuel the appetites of great gray owls, which come to meadows in winter, red foxes gathering food for their young. And they're used by wolves, eastern wolves and Algonquin, but not because they find food there. Wolves bring the pups this time of year through August, September into these meadows. And here the pups play and grow. The adults bring food to them. Here's an adult returning to the edge of one. The adults gobble down food. The pups swarm them. This is a moving pup here, biting the corner of the mouth. The adults cough out the food and the young eat it. I call this system of feeding young wolves meals on heels. And the pups have a great time playing around these meadows. They do a lot of howling. Very, very vocal. So if you hear wolves howling in August, young wolves, pups, you are definitely hearing animals at a rendezvous site. And they're called rendezvous sites because the adults and pups meet together regularly. It's funny, these meadows are used by wolves, which also eat beavers, by the way. And the meadows are also used by moose this time of year. In September, early October, moose go down to beaver meadows quite commonly, where the females call during the night for the bulls. And the bulls come down to greet them and impress them with their antlers. This one's not so much impressive. This one's not so much impressive either. But how about this one here? He was a beauty. And a large part of moose natural history takes place in beaver meadows in the fall when the mating season, the rut, is on. So beaver meadows and the whole pond complex are really important ecosystems. They support a remarkable diversity of life in all their different forms, whether it's beaver meadows, transforming to a forest again, or the open pond itself. That is why I call beavers the most powerful animal in the world. They create a habitat that will change through time, and at every stage, their habitat supports a remarkable diversity of other living things, all because beavers built dams and created ponds. Ponds are places of great beauty and great diversity, from large to the small. There are so many organisms present in a beaver pond, all benefiting from it in different ways.
That's all it was.
There's another aspect too of beaver activity. They create a world full of abstracts. And of course, artists love all sorts of aspects of life, including abstracts. Well, beavers create abstracts, whether they're swimming through reflections or just a lodge sitting in a tree, a dead tree filled pond, or a mass of whirligigs swirling on the water's surface, or the stems of aquatic plants in late autumn with full reflections, or just a mass of water shield leaves, or smartweed in profusion. Beavers create this remarkable world that gives us so much, so much. And that goes for all the seasons. And here's a beaver right here, sitting at the edge of a glorious winter landscape. And I think it's so important that people understand the role that beavers play and get a chance to meet the animal and see its fascinating lifestyle and see the diversity of living things that benefit from beaver activity. And I think that every school should have compulsory field trips for students down to beaver ponds. Maybe not so much in winter when it can be cold, but certainly in a warm season. And I think once children are exposed to the magic of a beaver pond, they would really enjoy life much more and be more interested in the natural world and get away from the cell phones and computers and the artificial world we have created. I think all schools should do this. And if you ask me where the pot of gold lies, it lies on a beaver lodge or at the edge of a beaver pond. We owe much to the beaver. And I'll go back to the original comment or quote I had from Ernest Thompson Seton. Because I've known the torment of thirst, I would dig a well where others may drink. I hope all of you had a little bit to drink tonight and not just your beverage as you watch this program. Great. Thanks very much.
Very good. Yeah, that was really good, Mike.
Okay, I'll stop sharing screen. There we are. You can see your faces. Pardon my
Yeah.
voice. I lectured for 4 hours before I talked to you, and my voice is kind of going.
Well, you did well. Is there anyone that has any questions they'd like to pose to Mike?
I see Ken's hand up.
Mike, how long do beavers live?
I think the average that they've looked at is toward 13 years. 10 years is an old beaver, and I think 13. In captivity, of course, they can live a bit longer, but as I understand, between 10 and 13 years is sort of the range of beavers in the wild, if they're lucky, because the toughest time is when they're young and when they disperse at the age of 2, because then they're moving around and are more prone to being caught. But once they pass that 2-year-old stage and they are able to form a new colony and start a pond up and so on, then the longevity can be good. But the main predator is the eastern wolf, and they certainly get a number of beavers, but still on average, it's often toward 10 years for an adult.
The reason I ask is that we seem to have had a bunch of beavers around here in Stratford on the Avon River
Hmm.
for several years, but lately I haven't noticed too many of them, and wondered whether they died off or whether they'd moved or
Yeah.
what had happened.
Or did humans get involved? Yeah, you never know.
Well, we know they're there. I mean, we see them occasionally, but you said that people don't like to see dead trees, but people don't like to see stumps either. And
Yes, that's true. Yeah, they don't like to see trees, period, being affected by beavers in any way at all.
Yeah.
we have where we do the cruises bird count in London, it's been heavily infiltrated by beavers in Stony Creek in the
Yes.
eastern side. And I mean, beaver ponds and the keepers try to do everything they can to protect the trees, and they put a fence up a meter, and the beaver chews it off at the meter and 1 centimeter.
Mm,
This-
mhm. Yeah, what I would suggest trying though is because they use their power of smell to discriminate which tree to cut down, put something on that would discriminate or that would affect their ability to detect what lies
What the
beneath.
tree is.
And yeah, so it would be a good experiment. I had a student here a number of years ago do a study on beavers. And what we did was we put out pieces of branches, all the same length at the edge of a beaver pond with trail cam set up. And we had poplar and we had red maple and we had white pine, I think balsam fir. And beavers would always come and smell and they would pull the poplar back in the water again. But then we cut the bark off and made a potion out of it. And we would paint balsam fir on poplar and paint poplar on balsam fir and so on, and found that beavers inevitably would still pull a branch down that smelled like poplar, even though it could be a balsam fir branch. And so really you can fool beavers with scent. And that might be the proper way. I should create a potion and copyright it. Make a fortune on it, because that's a big problem for people. But none of people do that. If you do that ahead of me, I still get part of your potion.
Beaver repellent.
Yeah.
There's a question online, are there any trees beavers won't eat?
Yeah, well, they often will cut trees that they're not eating because they
Yeah.
use the branches as ballast on top of the food pile.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So yeah, there's a number they won't eat. In desperation, they will eat things. I've seen beavers
Yeah.
eat black spruce,
Yeah.
and that's more of a desperation food.
Yeah.
But generally, they're quite discriminating, and that's often why beavers leave an area if they run out of palatable foods.
Mhm.
But as they can live on aquatic plants almost entirely, because in
Yeah.
one study done, they found that beavers were surviving in winter, not so much on a food pile of branches, but by digging up the underwater rhizomes of water lilies and eating those.
Mhm.
That's rare though, I think, because the
Yeah.
vast majority of beaver ponds I've been to, pretty well 99% of them create food piles. And
Mhm.
those food piles have on top less edible items like cedar or like spruce or like
Yeah.
what else, and the good stuff gets down below. And it's funny, in earlier studies on beavers, when they examined food piles, they'd examine the top part and
Mhm.
conclude that speckled alder were a very important food for beavers. But speckled alder is not, it's not very nutritious. And
Yeah.
so that's used for building materials and
Yeah.
used for ballast on top of the food pile.
Yeah.
So just like a book, you can't always judge a food pile by its cover.
Yes. Great. Anyone else? No. Well, that was a great presentation, Mike. I really like the images. It's a great tour of parts of Ontario, that's for sure. Yeah, I'd like to thank you on behalf of the Natchez. I really like to thank you for doing that for us.
Well, thank you. I'm glad we pulled it off. We had a couple of scares there.
Yeah.
But it worked out.
Yeah.
I hope my course here at Carleton works out as well.
Yeah.
This worked out after this morning.
Yeah. Okay.
Let me ask one more question, if I might.
Sure.
I know that they're trying to repopulate England with beavers.
Mhm.
these days. Would they be European beavers that they would be introduced?
Yes,
or-
Eurasian beavers. Yeah, same for Scotland. When they had the Scottish beaver trials in, it was Eurasian beaver. They know
Oh.
now the difference, and they know the error in bringing over North American beavers. So yeah, these will be Eurasian beavers, which are doing a comeback on their own. Certainly in Scotland, they are increasing.
Mhm.
But the problem is the North American beavers brought over to spots like Finland, and I think, well, if I forget, Switzerland as well. But they're doing pretty well. And but the problem is not they don't hybridize with the Eurasian beaver. That's one fear, but they don't do that. Different chromosome account.
Mhm.
But they will compete for habitat.
Mhm.
So in some areas, North American beavers are out competing Eurasian beavers, and so that's the thought. And I
Mhm.
know they're asking me over there, the experts on Eurasian beaver, how to tell the difference. Can I see a difference? Because if you declare the North American beaver to be invasive and it needs to be controlled, and you can't really visually tell the difference, how do you do it? You probably have to capture them and do a DNA sample and see what it is before you take any action against them. It's not that easy.
Good.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Hi. My name's Jacqueline. Hi. Michael, thank you very much. It was really interesting. I love beavers. The cottage that I go to every summer is in the St. Lawrence River, and I'm in a bay. So there are beaver families that I watch every single night, really. One of the things is I swim multiple times a day, just sort of quietly by myself, and I snorkel. And I just want to know if this is highly irregular behavior or how curious beavers are. Like, I know the minks will always come up and kind of try to figure out what I'm doing on shore
Yes.
and things like that. But I've never had this before. The one time I was snorkeling along by myself, just kind of poking along slowly. And all of a sudden, I saw this massive brown thing in front of me and just stopped, of course, because I wasn't sure what it was, and just, breathed. And then as it went by, I saw its tail and realized a beaver had come up within, I'd say, maybe a foot and a half of me, swim style, like obviously curious, right up to me, and just went right by me. And they had been circling me. Two of them had been circling me when I was doing my morning sort of wash and swim,
Yeah.
closer and closer. And so I just wonder, is that usual that they get used to people?
Well, they actually can. And what I learned, not only with our beavers here, but also when I was in Norway, that beavers, which makes sense, can discriminate between individual people. And I found that if I go to a new pond where I haven't been before, and the beavers are always slapping their tails, if I stand really quietly by the pond's edge, especially at daybreak when they're still active or at sunset, they will go around, slap their tail repeatedly. If I stand still for a couple of hours, then they seem to calm down. I'll come back another day, same thing happens. But eventually they stop completely and do their things. That's why I got many of those photographs. And
Oh.
if I bring somebody else with me, though, I had a friend who wanted to come see the beavers. I was, photographing. He came and stood beside me, still as can be. Beaver came up, smelt the air, slapped the tail. We never saw it again. So they do recognize individual people, and they will get used to them. When I was at Norway, at first it was a tough time for getting beaver photographs because many of the beavers were in faster flowing rivers. And that's hence probably the narrower tail. And it was so difficult to try to photograph them. But I finally went on my own and I found beavers in a creek. And the same thing happened, slapped their tails and were gone. But I hid in the alders and I stood motionless it got light early in the morning. So it was like 3 o'clock or something. I was standing there. And after a couple of hours, the beaver went by, slapped his tail, but I didn't move. And then finally, I heard a sound behind me. So I very slowly turned my head and looked out of the corner of my eye, and there's a big beaver within 2 meters of me, cutting down alders, which would drive back to the water. And after that moment, I could go there. There's the pond, and I never had the tail slap again. They go up on the far side and groom and things like that. And so I really cemented my belief that they can recognize individual humans. And once they ascertain that there's no real threat to them, they will finally give you liberties. And if you, whether you're swimming or standing on the shore.
Yeah, neat.
Thank you.
Yes, very good. Any other questions that anyone would like to ask? No?